There is something formidable about tracking, and it is not because tracking is glamorous or exciting. It's because once something becomes visible in front of you, it becomes genuinely hard to ignore. And that shift from invincible to visible is where everything starts to change. Most people assume progress comes from motivation, but in my own experience, it does not. Progress comes from clarity, and clarity almost always begins with something you can actually see. Hi everyone, this is Daniel with Ananti, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, this is where I document my mortgage payoff journey, building useful iOS apps from scratch with AI assistance, and share what I'm learning about living intentionally instead of by default. Today, I want us to talk about why tracking is more powerful than most people realize, and why I believe it's one of the quietest but most transformative habits you can build in your life. Most people treat tracking like administrative work, like something boring, something mechanical, something you do after the real work is already done. But tracking is not just about recording what happened. It is actually about changing what happens next. Because when a fact becomes visible, it stops being a vague feeling and starts becoming something you have to respond to. And the facts are much harder to negotiate with than feeling. Let that sink in. That is why I think tracking is one of the most underrated habits in life. It creates a feedback loop, and feedback is what actually changes behavior over time. Personally, that first became obvious with my mortgage. When I bought my home in 2023, that loan was $378,000 at 5.625%, and over the 30-year term, that total repayment would have come up to more than $783,000, with over $405,000 of that going to interest for the bank to splurge on. That number was staggering, but what actually changed everything was not the number itself. It was seeing it clearly enough to finally respond to it. Luckily for me, from the onset of my mortgage journey, I built a tracker and started recording every payment, every extra dollar I put towards the principal, and every windfall I redirected instead of letting it disappear in the general flow of life. And over time, that tracker did something powerful. It turned a vague hope into a visible path. The tracking did not create discipline out of nowhere. It simply revealed whether my actions were actually aligned with my intentions, and that gap between what I said I wanted and what I was actually doing was no longer something I could talk my way around. Peter Drucker famously said, "What gets measured gets managed," and I agree with that 100%, but I think it's only part of the story. What gets measured also gets understood, and once something is understood, it becomes far more difficult to ignore and far easier to correct. And that matters because most failures in life is not dramatic, it is gradual. It is slow drift that happens when nothing is being measured, and you can still believe you are moving forward when actually you are standing still. Tracking removes that illusion, and once that illusion is gone, the next step becomes obvious. I saw the same thing when I started building my apps. I'm not a traditional developer. I had no coding background when I began, but what I did have was the habit of tracking the problems in front of me long enough to understand what was actually worth solving. Payoff Pro came from me tracking my mortgage. Hindsight came from tracking the patterns behind my decisions. Minute came from building a pause before the purchase. And Show Up came from tracking the relationship I was quietly avoiding and realizing that intentions means very little if never becomes actions. And that is why I do not think tracking is really about numbers. It is about the truth, because a tracker tells you what you are actually doing, not what you meant to do. That gap between intention and reality is where most people stay stuck for years without realizing it. Once you close that gap, everything changes. You stop guessing, you stop romanticizing effort, and you start seeing the feedback loop in real time. So you know what is working, you know what is not working, and you know exactly what deserves another month of your energy. That is why tracking feels formidable to me. Not because it's complicated, but because it removes the fog. And once the fog lifts, the next step usually becomes obvious on its own. So maybe the real question is not whether you are disciplined enough. Maybe the question is whether your life is visible enough to guide you. So sometime this week, pick one thing: your spending, your sleep, your workout, a debt, a project, or a relationship you keep avoiding, and start tracking it. Not because tracking solves everything, but because without it, the real answers never have a chance to surface. There is definitely something formidable about that. Thank you for spending the time with me, and carry this one thing forward. What you actually track, you actually stop pretending about. Thank you. Catch you in the next one.